Evergrande is China's largest property development company and was, up until recently, one of the most valuable companies in the world. However, most analysts are now predicting that this company is on the verge of insolvency and won't be able to meet its mountainous debt obligations without direct government intervention within the next few weeks. For those of you who are not already aware, this has the potential to be far more than a run-of-the-mill corporate bankruptcy. The company employs over 200,000 people directly, while also providing work for as many as 4 million subcontractors who work to erect thousands of buildings for the company every year. Beyond just job losses, the company is also holding deposits for 1.5 million properties that may or may not be delivered to regular Chinese citizens who are just looking for a home or an investment property. Now, losing a home is terrible in any country, but perhaps nowhere more so than in China. The value of these properties compared to the incomes of people buying them is astronomical, and it often takes multiple family generations to save up for a deposit. Because of this, real estate has become basically the only thing that most people invest in, and over 1 million people losing that investment will have massive knocks on economic impacts beyond just putting people out on the streets, as if that wasn't already bad enough. Despite these social issues and the apparent threat to the national and global economy, the Chinese government has said that they are not prepared to bail out the company. Why? Well, politics. But there are a few things that you need to understand about this crisis as we watch it play out in real time. The first is how this collapse actually started in what looked like an otherwise very healthy company. The second is how bad this could get if the government doesn't step in. And the third is, will this all be contained? Or could this leak out and cause an economic collapse in countries outside of China? Well, it's time to learn how money works so you can have a better understanding about what all these alarming headlines really mean. This video was brought to you by the channel's patrons and channel members. If you want early access to videos and an extra free video every month, please consider helping the channel out on either of these platforms. Alright, so many people are calling this China's Lehman moment, in reference to the American investment bank Lehman Brothers, which was allowed to go bankrupt in 2008, effectively kicking off the 2008 global financial crisis. And there are a lot of similarities here. Both of these companies are very large. They both have a lot of debt on their books. That debt is being offset with assets that may not be nearly as valuable as most people might think. And finally, they both look to have been left for dead by their governments, which have decided to let them fail. Now, of course, Evergrande is not a bank. It's a property development company. But in China, that's almost worse. Property is basically the only thing that average citizens invest in, so it's as if you took the US financial market and housing market and rolled them all up into one for people to speculate on, sort of like in 2008. Now, the regulators knew this, and they saw the problem of an asset price bubble having the potential to cause major economic failures. It's because of this that the story of Evergrande's problems actually started more than a year ago in August of 2020. Property is never owned in China. It is leased from the government for a set amount of time, most commonly 70 years. These land leases are then purchased by property developers like Evergrande. The property developers will then design apartment buildings and pre-sell units they designed to regular investors who will put down a deposit and wait for the buildings to actually be finished. The developer can then take this money and use it as a down payment to borrow even more money to either buy up more land leases or to use on actual construction of buildings on that land. This system works very well for rapid expansion, and it is in theory a win-win for everybody. Evergrande and the other developers were able to buy up more 70-year leases and build more houses. Regular investors were able to get access to properties that were far cheaper than the existing apartments for sale in China, and the banks and non-bank lenders were able to give money to an institution that was offering good returns on a secured line of credit. Most of these lenders figured that in the extremely unlikely scenario that a company like Evergrande defaulted on its debts, they could just yoink all that property that they had on their books and easily cover for all these loans. Now, Evergrande had seen that properties in China were appreciating at a rate of about 10 to 15% per year, so they wanted to push this limit to the extreme. They wanted to borrow more money, buy up more land rights, pre-sell more apartments, all in an attempt to grow as fast as possible. This did work well, and the company was highly profitable. It always had more assets than liabilities, and continually gave consistent returns to both equity and debt investors. But all good things must come to an end, and that brings us back to August of 2020, when the Chinese government introduced new laws to control the amount of debt that developers could take on, and also how the money that companies like Evergrande were getting from pre-sales could be used. This was a big problem because it radically altered the high-growth business model that the company had become reliant on. The company basically needed a constant stream of new money coming in from property buyers to keep the whole operation running, but it did have a backup plan. If this money ever slowed down, the developer could just lower the prices on their pre-sales to attract more buyers and prop up the system again. Sure, they wouldn't make as much profit, but it's better than nothing. In a worst-case scenario, the company just kept certain properties on their books as real estate assets. This meant that they could borrow even more against the value of these finished properties and never need to realize a loss by selling a property for more than it cost to build. This was not a bad strategy, considering property price growth in China meant that the company only ever needed to hold on to these properties for a few months at most, before market forces made them profitable to sell again. However, these new regulations meant that the company was forced to hold on to more and more existing properties while also needing to sell off their new developments at increasingly steep discounts to keep the money flowing in. This caused two problems. For starters, it undermined all the holdings that they had to offset their liabilities. I said at the beginning of this video that the company had more assets than it did in liabilities, and that is technically true, but only if you accept that hundreds of billions of dollars worth of residential real estate holdings are worth as much as the company says it is. Even if we ignore the propensity of Chinese companies to massage their figures a bit, this is an alarming number because these assets are not liquid, which leads us to the next problem. The new regulations have made it harder for the company to borrow money to complete the projects it was working on. This has meant that the company has had to sell more pre-sales to fund existing projects, which are in turn going to be even harder to get funding for. The questions raised about the true value of the company's real estate holdings has meant that the company has had to seek financing from not just one or two banks like most companies, but from over 128 different banks and hundreds of other non-bank lenders. This started to raise alarm bells with individual property investors who were waiting for their homes to be finished. Potential investors were starting to see these massive real estate development projects that used to sell out within a matter of hours were now being discounted over and over again to try and attract buyers. Even if their overall attitude towards the real estate market was bullish, it only made sense to sit back and see if they could snag themselves a bigger discount. This closed the faucet on the cash injector that kept everything going, causing bigger discounts and bigger question marks over how much the company's inventory of property was actually worth. Now, the company is in a situation where it lacks the funds it needs to pay for day-to-day operations beyond the next few weeks. Of course, it could sell off these existing real estate assets as a last-ditch attempt to free up some cash flow, but it would now be at a massive discount given the bad press and the fact that they wouldn't really have time to negotiate too hard on price. That leads us on to how bad this could get. If the government did not intervene at all, the company would go into liquidation. The 1.5 million people that have paid deposits on homes that have not yet been built would lose that money, and the properties on the company's books would be sold off as quickly as possible, flooding the market with properties for sale. Even in a country as hungry for real estate as China, this would inevitably drive down prices. It would simultaneously put more eyes on the other property development companies who would inevitably be in a similar situation. If property prices fall, then their inventories are going to be worth less too, meaning they will have less assets to secure loans against, which means more difficulty completing projects, which means more trouble paying off loans, which means more liquidations. If you replace the words Chinese apartments with mortgage-backed securities, it is easy to see why people are calling this a Lehman moment. Which leaves just one final question. Will this impact markets in the West? The global financial crisis quickly spread from the US to Europe. China is the second largest economy in the world, so it's not unreasonable to be a little concerned with the same thing happening here, right? Well, yeah. We should all be cautious of what this could mean, but I wouldn't be overly worried just yet. China's markets are by design very closed off to the outside world, which means that they are much less interconnected with the American markets than, say, American markets are with European markets. What's more is that it's hard to believe that the Chinese government would let it get quite that bad. The strength and unfaltering growth of the economy has been the linchpin of the current government. If they were to lose that, they would not only have to deal with an economic catastrophe, but also widespread civil unrest as well. As I said, this is a developing situation, so your guess about what comes next is just about as good as mine, but at least you know the nuts and bolts of the problem that they are facing. Now, if you want to learn something a little bit more lighthearted, then go watch my video on why jellyfish have secretly been used as a global reserve currency for the past few decades. These videos are made possible by my amazing channel members and Patreon supporters. If you enjoy these videos, please consider supporting the channel directly so that everybody can keep on learning how money works.